One of the first things people ask me about when I talk about my hobbies as a spearfisherman and my work as a dive master is how deep do you go? When non-divers ask this question, I can tell they're looking for a juicy morsel about how deep, dark, and dangerous my diving is. Truth be told, it's not so dangerous. Although if I'm in the mood to fall into a stereotype as an adrenaline junkie, sometimes I'll support it. Today, I'll tell you about the time I dove to the bottom of an offshore wind turbine alone and shot a bluefish at 70 feet on a single breath. At 5 a.m. on a foggy July morning, my brother and I set out to dive the Block Island Wind Farm in our 17-foot Jones Brothers. The ride took about an hour and a half as the fog was relentless, and we had to be sure we weren't going to run into the high-speed ferry or another fishing boat. The boat cut the swell, and we used our instruments to navigate to the turbines. After our hour and 30-minute ride, we passed the Yellow Atlantic Shark Institute buoy, which uses acoustic sensors to track the locations of tagged sharks. That week, there had been 4 great white shark pings. However, I was adamant on completing the dive. As we pulled up to the wind farm, the first 40 feet of the base of the turbine was not visible in the dense fog, but when you looked up, you could see the massive turbine wings turning. Geared up, with my spear gun in hand, I jumped off the boat and took refuge in the current behind the massive column that supports the turbine. I closed my eyes and began to slow my heart rate by breathing deeply and deliberately. In one motion, I took a full breath of air, spit out my snorkel, and dove while equalizing my ears. Upside down, I plunged as deep as I could. At 20 feet, I lost sight of the surface. At 30 feet, I equalized again as the depth caused me pain by compressing my ears and sinuses. At 45 feet, I hit the thermocline and the darkening water plummeted 15 degrees. At 60 feet, the air in my lungs was so compressed so much by the water above me that I began to free fall without having to kick my fins. At 70 feet, I began to hear the drum of striper and bluefish tails as I swam through their schools. Finally, at 80 feet, I grabbed the concrete base of the column and leveled myself in a horizontal position. The urge to breathe left me dizzy, and fear had elevated my heart rate. The turbine mechanism clicked and clacked ominously. I knew that if I began to panic, I risked shallow water blackout on my ascent, so I began to swim upward slowly. As my eyes adjusted to the dark green murk, I became aware that I was surrounded by dozens of 10 to 14-pound bluefish. I stopped my ascent, leveled my spear gun, and shot the shaft into an 11-pound fish. The fish bolted and the gun reel hissed as line unraveled off the spool. Now, 1 minute and 15 seconds into the dive, my contractions started. The urge to breathe was stronger than ever. With the bluefish tagged, I began the ascent. Adrenaline blurred my vision, and all I could think about was being able to breathe again. Increased pressure at depth can raise the partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs, allowing a diver to stay conscious at depth but unconscious at the surface. I knew that if I used too much oxygen ascending, I would black out in shallow water or at the surface. To combat shallow water blackout, I kicked my fins slowly to use less oxygen, although all I wanted to do was bolt for the surface. At 1 minute and 45 seconds, my head broke the surface underneath the honeycomb structure of the turbine. I spent 20 seconds loading oxygen with deep hook breaths, and then began to pull the fish, being careful not to get the line tangled around myself or the turbine. I landed the fish and raised it above my head to show my brother back on the boat with a victorious yell. He motored over, pulled me and the fish back on board. He looked at me, shook his head, and simply said, "You've got screws loose, man."